Section 1. You're on the couch at 11:48 p.m., lights off, phone inches from your face, telling yourself you're just going to read it once. It's your ex again. 2 lines that look harmless, but your stomach still drops like you just stepped off a curb you didn't see. What if the reason you can't move forward isn't that you still care, it's that you keep giving the relationship a doorway back into your nervous system? And what if staying in contact isn't proof you're mature, but proof you haven't decided what you actually need? This is the pain that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. You're not screaming, you're not begging, you're not even arguing most days. You're just reachable. And being reachable keeps you emotionally on call. A random miss you can hijack your evening. A vague hope you're doing well can make you reread everything you did wrong. A simple question can turn into a spiral where you're suddenly negotiating your worth in your own head. The stakes are real. If nothing changes, you lose hours of peace every week, you keep postponing your healing, and you quietly teach yourself that your boundaries don't matter when someone you care about knocks. Today, you're going to do 3 concrete things. You'll decide what level of contact actually serves your healing right now, not what feels polite in the moment. You'll learn how to communicate a boundary without reopening old fights or giving a long explanation that drains you. And you'll create enough emotional space for your heart to move forward, instead of staying stuck in almost, where you can't fully grieve and you can't fully build what's next. Educational content inspired by classical Stoic texts. Not medical, psychological, financial, or legal advice. If you want steady Stoic Focus lessons on emotional control, boundaries, and relationships every week, this is the channel for you. Stay with me until the very end, and while you're here, hit like, tap subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's get honest about what keeps this loop alive. It's rarely just romance. Sometimes it's guilt. Sometimes it's loneliness. Sometimes it's the fear that if you create distance, you'll be seen as the villain. Sometimes it's the comfort of familiarity, because even the pain is familiar, and the unknown feels worse. And sometimes it's the quiet hope that staying available keeps a future door open, even if you never say that out loud. You tell yourself you're being kind. But what you're often doing is protecting yourself from the discomfort of finality. And that discomfort is exactly where healing begins. Here's the bold claim: you can still care about your ex and still reduce contact. You can still wish them well and still protect your attention. You can still be a decent person and still decide, calmly, that access to you is limited now. Stoic thinking helps here because it doesn't ask you to pretend you feel nothing. It asks you to act from what you can control. You don't control whether your ex misses you, regrets things, or wants to keep a thread between you. You do control your availability. You control the pace of your replies. You control whether you keep walking into conversations that leave you unsettled for hours. A lot of people think boundaries are aggressive. They picture slammed doors, blocked numbers, harsh speeches. But most boundaries are quiet. They're containers. They define what a relationship is allowed to be now, so your mind stops improvising in every moment. Without a container, every message becomes a question mark. Are we friends? Are we still emotionally responsible for each other? Is this flirting? Is this closure? Is this an opening? And question marks keep your body alert. They keep you scanning. They keep you in a state where you can't fully relax, because you don't know what the next text means for your life. The hardest part is that this can feel like love. You might call it being there. You might call it we ended on good terms. You might even say it would be cruel to ignore them. But there's a difference between compassion and access. Compassion is a value. Access is a privilege. When access keeps costing you sleep, focus, and emotional stability, your values aren't being honored anymore, they're being used as a reason to avoid a tough decision. So the goal today isn't to become cold. The goal is to become clear. Clarity is what allows kindness to exist without self-betrayal. Clarity is what prevents that late-night doom-scrolling through old photos. Clarity is what keeps you from replying in a rush just to relieve the anxious pressure in your chest. And clarity is what makes it possible to build a life that isn't shaped by the unpredictable rhythms of someone you used to love. As you listen, notice your own pattern. Do you feel an urge to respond immediately so you don't look mean? Do you over-explain because you want them to understand you perfectly? Do you agree to check in calls even when you know you'll feel heavy afterward? Do you stay in contact because you're afraid of the silence, not because the contact actually supports you? This isn't about judging yourself. It's about observing your behavior like a calm witness. Marcus Aurelius wrote about returning to yourself and refusing to be dragged around by impressions. In modern life, one of the most powerful versions of that is learning not to be dragged around by notifications. You might be thinking, but they're not doing anything wrong. Exactly. That's what makes it confusing. The messages are often polite. The tone is often neutral. But your internal experience is the evidence. If contact keeps pulling you back emotionally, then it's doing damage even if no one intended harm. Intent doesn't erase impact. And your nervous system doesn't care whether the text was kind. It cares whether it leaves you safe or unsettled. Here's the roadmap for where we're going, and I'm going to keep it simple so you can feel the progression. First, we're going to define what contact is for now, because a vague connection is the fastest way to stay emotionally tangled. Next, we'll talk about how to choose a contact level that protects your healing without turning you into someone you don't respect. Then, we'll build one calm, short way to communicate boundaries that doesn't invite debate or reopen the relationship. After that, we'll deal with the biggest trap, the pull to explain, justify, or defend your choice when you feel guilty. Finally, we'll pressure test everything in a real moment where your ex reaches out at the worst possible time and you feel that familiar tug to fall back into the old dynamic. And later, I'm going to walk you through a Friday night situation. Your phone buzzes while you're finally starting to feel okay, and you're tempted to answer the way you always have. But instead you use one sentence that keeps you steady, ends the loop politely, and lets you go to sleep without replaying the conversation in your head. Section 2. The first thing to change is this: stop asking whether staying in contact is okay, and decide what the contact is actually for. If you don't define its purpose, your nervous system will keep treating every message as unfinished business. And if you never change this, the cost is simple: you stay emotionally on standby for someone who no longer shares your life. Here's why this works. Your brain hates ambiguity. When something has no clear role, your mind keeps scanning it for meaning, danger, or opportunity. That's why a single "hey" from your ex can hijack your attention for hours. You're not reacting to the words, you're reacting to the uncertainty. A calmer, more focused version of you doesn't ask, "What does this mean?" They ask, "Does this serve the life I'm building right now?" Once contact has a defined purpose, your body stops bracing every time their name appears, because the rules are already set. So before we talk about boundaries, scripts, or messages, you need one internal decision. Not a dramatic one. A quiet one. You decide whether contact is for logistics only, occasional check-ins with clear limits, or not for now. Notice what's missing from that list: comfort, reassurance, emotional processing, or keeping a door open. Those are relationship functions. When the relationship ends, those functions either end or they keep you emotionally tethered. There's no neutral middle ground, even if it feels polite. Here's the exact line to say to yourself when you feel pulled to respond out of habit: if this contact doesn't support my healing, it doesn't get my energy right now. Say it exactly like that. No anger. No justification. Just clarity. Picture a very normal North American scene. It's Tuesday afternoon, you're at work, juggling Slack messages and a deadline. Your phone buzzes on your desk. It's your ex, sending a casual update about something that happened at their job. You would feel that familiar mix of warmth and tension. You'd think it would be rude not to respond, and fire back something friendly, even though you know it'll linger in your head all evening. You pauses. You remember you decided contact is only for necessary logistics right now, not emotional updates. You don't feel dramatic about it. You don't feel cruel. You just don't engage. Maybe you respond hours later with a neutral acknowledgement, or maybe you don't respond at all. And instead of spiraling, you notice something surprising. You finish your work faster, your shoulders drop, and your evening feels like it actually belongs to you. The tiny action here is simple and measurable. Today, write down, on your phone or a piece of paper, one sentence that defines what contact with your ex is for right now. One sentence only. Logistics about shared responsibilities. Or, no contact for 30 days while I reset. Or, occasional check-ins, no emotional processing. If it takes more than one sentence, it's probably still vague. This sentence is not for them yet. It's for you. Now slow this down for a moment. Right now, take a breath in through your nose, hold it for a second, and let it out slowly. Do that 2 more times. As you breathe, notice how your body feels when you imagine not having to decide in the moment whether to respond. That sense of relief is data. It's your nervous system telling you that clarity is safer than constant availability. One common resistance shows up here: but what if they need me? That thought feels noble, but it quietly puts you back in a role you no longer occupy. Caring doesn't require access. Being a good person doesn't require emotional availability on demand. Stoic writers like Seneca warned about scattering your attention and draining yourself for obligations you never consciously chose. In modern terms, this is about choosing where your limited emotional energy goes. If you don't choose, other people's needs will choose for you. Let's make this practical in another everyday scenario. You're driving home after a long day, stuck in traffic, already tired. Your ex calls unexpectedly. You would answer automatically, heart rate picking up, wondering what this means. Now you see the call and remember your one-sentence rule. Contact is not for spontaneous emotional conversations right now. You let it go to voicemail. Maybe later you send a short text: "Hey, I can't talk right now. Hope you're well." And that's it. No follow-up. No explanation. You don't spend the drive rehearsing what you would have said. You turn on a podcast or sit in silence. You arrive home less drained than usual. This isn't avoidance. It's containment. You're not pretending the relationship didn't matter. You're recognizing that healing requires fewer open channels, not more. And the moment you stop using contact as a way to regulate your emotions, you start learning how to regulate them yourself. That's where real strength builds. Here's another slow practice moment, and I want you to actually do this as you listen. Say this sentence with me once, out loud if you can. I don't need to stay reachable to prove I care. Say it again, slower. Notice if any guilt comes up. Don't argue with it. Just notice it. Guilt often shows up right before growth, because it's the feeling that tells you you're changing a role you used to play. If you're wondering when you communicate this to your ex, hold that question. For now, this section is about internal alignment. When you know what contact is for, your words later will be shorter, calmer, and less charged. Without that decision, every boundary sounds like a debate, because even you're not sure what you want. So let this land. You don't need to cut anyone off today. You don't need to send a dramatic message. You just need to decide what this connection is for in this season of your life. Hold on to that one sentence you wrote. We're going to use it in the next part, when we talk about how unclear boundaries quietly keep emotional roles alive long after the relationship is over, and how to step out of that role without a fight. Section 3. The next shift is this: stop acting like the emotional roles ended just because the relationship did. If you don't consciously step out of the old role, you'll keep playing it automatically. And if this never changes, you stay emotionally responsible for someone who is no longer responsible for you. Here's why this matters. Relationships don't just end on paper, they end in habits. Who you used to be to each other lingers in tone, timing, and expectations. You might no longer be partners, but you still sound like the person who soothes them, reassures them, or fills emotional gaps. Your ex might not say it directly, but the dynamic stays alive because the behavior stays alive. A calmer, more grounded version of you recognizes this and understands that healing isn't just about less contact, it's about different contact. Think about the role you used to play. Were you the emotional regulator, the listener, the fixer, the one who always replied quickly? Did you absorb their stress so things stayed calm? Those roles don't dissolve automatically after a breakup. They dissolve when you stop performing them. And the discomfort you feel when you pull back isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign the role is losing oxygen. Here's the exact line to use internally when you feel that old pull: "That was my role then. It's not my role now." Say it cleanly. No bitterness. No story. Just a statement of fact. Let's ground this in a familiar scene. It's Sunday evening. You're winding down, maybe prepping for the week, when your ex texts something emotional, frustration about their family, stress about work, or loneliness creeping in. Old you would drop everything. You'd respond thoughtfully, ask questions, offer reassurance, maybe even hop on a call. You'd feel close again for a moment, followed by that heavy, unsettled feeling afterward. New you pauses. You feel the reflex, but you remember that emotional processing was a relationship function. You reply with something kind but contained. You don't ask follow-up questions. You don't invite continuation. And when the conversation ends quickly, you notice you're still steady. You didn't abandon them. You simply didn't resume the role. The reason this works is simple. Emotional roles are reinforced by repetition. Every time you act like the partner, your body stays attached like the partnership still exists. When you change your behavior, your nervous system slowly updates. Stoic writers talked about not adding judgment to impressions. In modern terms, this means noticing the urge to step in without obeying it. You don't need to suppress the feeling. You just don't need to act it out. Here's the microscript you can use outwardly when needed, especially if they lean on you emotionally. I hear you. I'm not the right person for this kind of conversation anymore. That's it. No apology. No explanation. It's calm, respectful, and clear. Now imagine a different everyday scenario. You're on a dating app again, trying to move forward. You're chatting with someone new, but your ex still texts you late at night. Old you would juggle both, emotionally split, half present everywhere. New you see the pattern. You realize that staying in the old role is blocking the new one from forming. When your ex reaches out emotionally, you either don't engage or you respond briefly and redirect. And slowly, without drama, your emotional availability returns to you. You show up lighter, more present, less conflicted. The tiny action here is very specific. Today or tomorrow, identify one emotional role you used to play for your ex. Just one. Listener. Reassure. Problem solver. Late night companion. Write it down. Then decide one behavior you will stop doing that reinforces that role. One behavior only. Maybe it's no more late night replies. Maybe it's no phone calls. Maybe it's no emotional advice. You don't need a list. You need one clean change. Let's slow this down with a short practice. Right now, bring to mind the last time your ex reached out and you felt pulled. Notice where that pull shows up in your body: tight chest, urge to respond, restlessness. Take a slow breath in, hold, and out. As you breathe out, say quietly to yourself, I'm allowed to step out of this role. Sit with that for a moment. You're not rejecting the past. You're updating the present. A common fear surfaces here: they'll think I don't care anymore. Maybe they will. And that's uncomfortable. But clarity often looks like distance to someone who benefited from your constant availability. Your job isn't to manage their interpretation. It's to manage your capacity. If you keep cushioning their emotions, you keep delaying your own recovery. Another subtle trap is overcorrecting. You might feel tempted to be cold or abrupt to prove you're done. That's just another reaction. Calm consistency is stronger. When you stop performing the role without hostility, the dynamic fades on its own. No announcement required. Picture this moment. You're at home on a Friday night. This will matter later. You finally feel okay. Maybe you're watching something, cooking, or just enjoying the quiet. Your phone lights up. It's your ex, reaching out in that familiar way. You feel the reflex to step back into the role. But instead, you pause. You remember your one-sentence rule from earlier. You remember the role you're no longer playing. You respond briefly or not at all. And the night stays yours. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect in action. Repeat this line with me once more, out loud if you can. I don't have to keep a role alive to honor what we had. Say it again, slower. Let your body hear it. This section is about something quiet but powerful. You don't heal by explaining yourself perfectly. You heal by behaving differently over time. When the old role stops being rewarded with access, it dissolves. And when it dissolves, something surprising happens. You start to feel like yourself again, not someone orbiting a past relationship. Hold on to this. In the next part, we're going to talk about how to communicate boundaries without triggering debates, guilt, or long emotional back and forths, so you can stay kind without reopening the door you're finally closing. Section 4. The next adjustment is this: stop explaining your boundaries as if they're up for negotiation. When you over-explain, you invite debate, and debate pulls you right back into the emotional loop you're trying to exit. If this doesn't change, every boundary becomes another exhausting conversation that leaves you doubting yourself. Here's why this works. Explanation sounds reasonable, but emotionally it signals uncertainty. The more reasons you give, the more it feels like you're asking for permission. Your ex may not even intend to push back, but long explanations activate the old dynamic where feelings, intentions, and history get rehashed. A calmer, steadier version of you understands that clarity doesn't come from saying more. It comes from saying less and standing still afterward. Most people over-explain because they're trying to prevent guilt. You want to be understood so you don't feel like the bad one. But guilt doesn't come from being unclear, it comes from acting against your values. When your boundary aligns with what you actually need, you don't have to convince anyone. You just have to communicate it once and then behave consistently. Here's the exact microscript to use when you're ready to state a boundary, either in a message or out loud: I'm not available for this kind of contact anymore. I wish you well. That's it. No timeline. No apology. No backstory. It's respectful, direct, and complete. Let's see how this plays out in a real, familiar situation. It's midweek. You're finally settling into a rhythm again: work, gym, dinner, sleep. Your ex texts something like, "Can we talk? I've been thinking a lot about us." Old you would feel the rush immediately. You'd start crafting a careful response, trying to be gentle, clear, and fair all at once. You'd explain where you're at, why now isn't a good time, how much you care, how complicated things are. 30 minutes later, you'd still be typing. New you pauses. You feel the old anxiety, but you remember that explanations reopen doors. You send one sentence. The conversation ends. It might feel awkward. But you don't spiral. Your night stays intact. Why this matters is subtle. Every time you explain, you re-enter the emotional arena. You start managing their feelings instead of your own. Stoic thinkers like Epictetus emphasize that peace comes from focusing on what's within your control and releasing the rest. Their reaction is not yours to manage. Your clarity is. Here's another everyday scene. You're co-parenting, or you share a lease, or there are real logistical ties that require some contact. Your ex uses a practical issue as a bridge into emotional territory. Old you would follow, because it feels rude not to. Now you answer the practical question cleanly and ignore the emotional bait. No transition sentence. No softening. The boundary is in the behavior, not the words. And because you don't explain, there's nothing to argue with. The tiny action for today is specific and short. Write one boundary sentence you can reuse. Just one. Not 5 options. One sentence that feels calm in your mouth. Save it in your notes. This isn't for drama. It's for the moment when your nervous system is activated and you're tempted to say too much. Having the sentence ready prevents emotional improvisation. Now let's slow this down with a brief practice. Right now, take a breath in, hold, and let it out slowly. As you exhale, imagine yourself sending that one sentence and then putting your phone face down. Notice the discomfort that comes up. Notice that nothing bad actually happens in your body. Discomfort is not dangerous. It's just unfamiliar. A big fear shows up here. They'll think I'm cold. Maybe. But coldness comes from indifference, not boundaries. Boundaries are what make respectful distance possible. When you explain less, you're not erasing the past. You're protecting the present. Another trap to watch for is the delayed explanation. You hold the boundary at first, then later send a follow-up message clarifying, softening, or justifying. That's usually driven by anxiety, not necessity. When that urge hits, use this internal line, "I've already said enough." Repeat it once. Then stop. Picture a different scenario. You're at work, deep into a task, finally focused. Your ex messages something emotionally charged. You feel the urge to respond quickly so you can get back to work without the distraction. You would respond with a paragraph, hoping to resolve the feeling. New, you send the boundary sentence or wait until your chosen reply window. You finish your work. The feeling passes. You didn't need resolution. You needed containment. This is where consistency matters more than perfection. The first time you explain less, it will feel awkward. The second time, less so. By the 5th time, the dynamic shifts. Your ex learns what kind of contact is available. More importantly, your body learns that you can tolerate the discomfort without collapsing or fixing. Let's do one more slow practice moment. Say this with me, quietly, "I don't owe clarity through explanation." Say it again, slower. Let your shoulders drop. You're not being harsh. You're being precise. Over time, shorter communication creates emotional distance without hostility. Long messages keep emotional proximity alive. If you want healing, your behavior has to match your intention. And one of the cleanest ways to do that is to stop turning boundaries into essays. Hold on to this idea. In the next part, we're going to address something even trickier: availability. Specifically, how responding immediately keeps emotional attachment alive, and how changing timing, not content, can radically reduce the pull without a single confrontation. Section 5. The next lever to adjust is availability. Not what you say, but when you say it. If you keep responding immediately, your nervous system stays tied to theirs, even if your words are neutral. And if this never changes, you remain emotionally synchronized with someone who no longer shares your life. Here's why timing matters more than content. Immediate responses signal priority. They tell your body, and theirs, that this connection still sits near the top of your attention stack. Even a short, polite reply delivered instantly reinforces the old rhythm: message, response, and relief, repeat. A calmer, more self-directed version of you understands that availability trains attachment. When you slow the timing, the emotional charge weakens on its own. Most people focus on wording and ignore timing. They think, as long as I'm not flirty or emotional, it's fine. But your nervous system doesn't track nuance that well. It tracks patterns. If every message from your ex interrupts your day and gets an immediate response, your body never fully stands down. You stay half alert, half waiting. That's why even harmless contact can leave you feeling unsettled. Here's the internal microscript to use when you feel the urge to reply right away: nothing bad happens if this waits. Say it once. Then pause. Now let's put this into a concrete scene. It's mid-morning. You're at work, finally focused, maybe in the middle of writing or preparing for a meeting. Your phone lights up. It's your ex, sending a casual message that doesn't require urgency. Old you would feel a jolt and reply quickly, just to clear it. You'd tell yourself it's efficient. Now you notice the impulse and do nothing. You let it sit. You finish your task. An hour later, the urgency is gone. When you do reply, if you reply, it's calmer, shorter, and less loaded. And you realize something important: the anxiety wasn't about the message. It was about the habit of immediacy. This works because immediacy collapses emotional distance. Delays restore it. Stoic thinkers emphasize not being carried away by the first impulse. In modern life, one of the cleanest ways to practice that is through response timing. You're not suppressing emotion. You're giving it time to settle before acting. Here's the exact outward microscript, if you need one, especially when delays feel awkward: I'll get back to you later. That's it. No reason. No time estimate. Just a statement. Use it sparingly, but confidently. Consider another familiar situation. It's evening. You're finally winding down. Your ex texts something that's not urgent but emotionally adjacent, maybe reflective, maybe nostalgic. Old you would respond because now's as good a time as any. New you decides that evenings are no longer reply time. You don't announce this as a rule. You just live it. The message waits until the next day. And you notice that your night feels quieter. Your sleep improves. Your thoughts don't orbit around someone who isn't there. The tiny action here is measurable and simple. Starting today, choose one reply window for your ex. Just one. Maybe it's late morning. Maybe it's early afternoon. Outside that window, you don't respond. You don't explain. You don't apologize. You just wait. This isn't about punishment. It's about retraining your nervous system. Let's slow this down with practice. Right now, imagine your phone buzzing. Feel the urge to check. Take a slow breath in, hold, and let it out. As you exhale, imagine not responding. Imagine the feeling cresting and then fading. Because it does fade. Urges peak and fall like waves if you don't chase them. One fear that shows up here is, what if they think I'm ignoring them? They might. And that discomfort is part of the transition. But remember, silence is not hostility. It's space. And space is often what allows emotional detachment to finally begin. If you rush to fill every gap, nothing ever resets. There's also a subtle form of self-betrayal to watch for. You delay responding, but you spend the entire delay thinking about the message. That's half a boundary. When you notice that happening, gently redirect. Put your phone away. Engage your body. Walk, stretch, focus on something concrete. The boundary isn't just behavioral, it's attentional. Here's another everyday example. You're out with friends, trying to reconnect with your own life. Your ex messages. Old you would sneak glances at your phone, half present, waiting for the right moment to reply. Now you see the message and put the phone away. You stay engaged. Later, you respond or don't. And you realize that protecting availability also protects presence. You're actually there with the people in front of you. Say this line with me once, out loud if you can: I don't need to respond immediately to be a good person. Say it again, slower. Let it settle. Over time, changing timing does something powerful. The emotional intensity of the connection drops without confrontation. The frequency of messages often decreases on its own. And even if it doesn't, your internal experience changes. Messages stop feeling like demands. They start feeling optional. Another common trap is compensating later. You delay, then send a longer, warmer message to make up for it. That just reintroduces the old dynamic. If you delay, keep the response proportionate. Neutral timing pairs best with neutral content. Picture this moment, because it will matter later. It's Friday night. You're finally relaxed. Your phone buzzes. You feel that familiar pull. Old you would answer and feel pulled back in. Now you notice the time, remember your reply window, and do nothing. You breathe. The moment passes. And the night stays peaceful. This isn't avoidance. It's self-leadership. This section is about something quiet but transformative. You don't have to say anything new to change a dynamic. Sometimes you just have to stop being instantly available. When you control timing, you control the pace of emotional engagement. And when the pace slows, clarity grows. Hold on to this. In the next part, we're going to deal with the hardest internal pressure of all, guilt. Specifically, how guilt shows up when you start pulling back, and how to distinguish between guilt that signals wrongdoing and guilt that simply signals growth. Section 6. The next pressure you have to face is guilt. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're doing something different. If you misread guilt as a signal to go back, you'll undo every boundary you've started to build. And if this never changes, guilt will quietly keep you available long after contact has stopped being healthy. Here's what's actually happening. When you reduce contact, explain less, and slow your responses, you're breaking an old emotional contract. Even if that contract was never spoken out loud, it existed in behavior. You showed up. You reassured me. You were there. When you stop doing that, guilt appears, not as proof of harm, but as evidence of change. A steadier version of you understands that guilt often shows up at the exact moment a boundary starts working. Most people treat guilt as a moral alarm. They assume it means, I'm hurting someone, or I'm being selfish. But guilt is often just your nervous system reacting to role loss. You're no longer who you used to be to this person, and your body hasn't caught up yet. That gap feels uncomfortable, but it's not a reason to reverse course. Here's the internal microscript to use when guilt spikes after you hold a boundary. This feeling is about change, not wrongdoing. Say it once. Let the feeling be there without trying to fix it. Now picture a familiar moment. You decide not to reply to your ex right away. Hours pass. You're proud of yourself until guilt creeps in. Thoughts start spinning. What if they're having a hard night? What if I'm being unfair? What if I'm becoming cold? Old you would cave right here. You'd send a message just to relieve the guilt. Now you notice the pattern. You remind yourself that guilt doesn't mean emergency. You sit with it. And something important happens, the guilt fades on its own. You didn't need to act to make it go away. This works because emotions peak and fall if you don't reinforce them. Acting on guilt trains it to come back stronger next time. Sitting with guilt teaches your nervous system that discomfort is survivable. Stoic thinkers wrote about tolerating unease instead of fleeing it, because that's how freedom is built. In modern life, this is one of the cleanest versions of that practice. Here's an outward microscript, useful if your ex directly pushes on your guilt by saying something like, I guess you don't care anymore. The line is simple, I care, and I still need space. Nothing more. You don't argue. You don't defend. You don't try to prove your sincerity. Let's ground this in another everyday example. It's late afternoon. You've had a decent day. Your ex messages something vulnerable. You feel compassion immediately, and then guilt, because you know engaging will pull you back emotionally. Old you would prioritize their feelings over your stability. New you recognizes that compassion doesn't require engagement. You either don't respond, or you respond briefly and redirect. The guilt hits hard for a few minutes. Then it softens. And your evening remains calm. The tiny action here is subtle but powerful. Today, write down one sentence that reminds you why you're creating distance. Just one. Something like, I'm doing this so I can heal and show up better in my life. Keep it somewhere easy to find. When guilt shows up, read it once. Don't debate with guilt. Just anchor yourself. Now let's slow this down with a short practice. Take a slow breath in, hold, and let it out. As you exhale, imagine guilt sitting beside you instead of inside you. You don't have to push it away. You don't have to obey it. You're just letting it be present while you stay steady. A common mistake here is confusing guilt with responsibility. You are not responsible for managing your ex's emotions anymore. That responsibility ended with the relationship. If you keep absorbing their feelings to avoid guilt, you stay emotionally entangled. Responsibility for your own well-being has to come first, or everything else collapses. There's another layer to guilt that's easy to miss: identity guilt. You might think, I'm not the kind of person who ignores people, or I've always been the caring one. When you change behavior, it can feel like you're betraying who you are. But identity isn't fixed. It evolves. You're not becoming uncaring, you're becoming discerning. And discernment is a form of maturity, not cruelty. Consider this scenario. You're finally starting to imagine a future that doesn't revolve around this person. The thought excites you, and immediately, guilt shows up. How can I move on when they're still struggling? Old you would stall your own progress. Now you notice that this guilt is actually a sign of separation happening. You don't punish yourself for healing. You let yourself continue. Say this line with me once, quietly: I'm allowed to choose my healing even if someone else feels uncomfortable. Say it again, slower. Notice how your body reacts. That reaction is where the work is. Another trap to watch for is preemptive guilt. You imagine how they'll feel if you pull back, and you feel guilty before anything even happens. That imagined guilt can be more powerful than the real thing. When you notice that, bring yourself back to facts. What have you actually done? You've set a reasonable boundary. You've reduced contact. You haven't attacked, insulted, or abandoned anyone. The rest is projection. Picture a moment that ties this together. You're alone one evening, phone nearby. You feel calm. Then guilt sneaks in, whispering that you should check in, just to be nice. Old you would act on it immediately. New you pauses. You breathe. You remember why you're doing this. You let the feeling pass. And the calm returns. That's not indifference. That's self-trust forming. This section is about reclaiming authority over your emotional signals. Guilt is information, not instruction. When you learn to tell the difference, you stop being yanked back into dynamics that no longer serve you. And once guilt loses its grip, boundaries stop feeling like battles and start feeling like alignment. Hold on to this insight. In the next part, we're going to talk about something that often undermines all of this without you realizing it: overchecking and mental rehearsing. Specifically, how replaying conversations keeps emotional attachment alive, and how to mentally clock out so your mind can finally rest. Section 7. The next thing to dismantle is what happens after the message, not during it. Even when you don't reply, you may still be replaying, rehearsing, and monitoring the situation in your head. And if this doesn't change, you stay emotionally attached even in silence. Here's the pattern. You don't respond, or you respond briefly, and on the outside it looks like progress. But internally, your mind keeps working overtime. You imagine what they'll think. You rehearse what you'll say if they follow up. You check your phone just in case. That mental activity keeps the emotional bond active. A calmer, more focused version of you understands that healing requires not just behavioral boundaries, but cognitive ones. Why this works is simple. Attention is energy. Wherever your attention goes repeatedly, your emotions follow. Even if contact is limited, constant mental engagement keeps the attachment loop alive. Stoic thinkers warned against allowing the mind to wander back to things that are no longer within your control. In modern terms, that means learning to mentally clock out instead of staying on emotional standby. Here's the internal microscript to use when you catch yourself replaying: this conversation is closed for today. Say it once, clearly. Then redirect. Let's put this into a very familiar scene. You send a short boundary message, or you choose not to reply. 10 minutes later, your mind starts spinning. Did that sound cold? What if they take it the wrong way? What if they respond angrily? Old you would follow that spiral all the way down. You check your phone repeatedly, half present in whatever you're doing. New you notice the spiral starting and interrupts it. You remind yourself the conversation is closed. You shift your attention deliberately, to a task, to movement, to something physical and real. This works because mental rehearsal is a form of emotional reattachment. Every imagined conversation keeps the bond warm. When you stop rehearsing, the emotional charge fades faster. You're not suppressing thoughts, you're choosing where to place your focus. Here's the outward microscript, useful if your ex does follow up later and you feel tempted to re-engage deeply. I don't want to revisit this. Short. Calm. Final. Now imagine another everyday scenario. You're lying in bed at night. The room is quiet. This is when the mind gets loud. You replay old conversations. You imagine alternate endings. You think about what you should have said. Old you would let that loop run until you feel heavy and restless. Now you notice the pattern and change the channel. You don't fight the thoughts. You label them, rehearsing, and gently redirect to something grounding, like your breath or the feeling of the bed beneath you. The tiny action here is concrete. Choose one physical action you'll use to break mental loops. 1. It could be standing up and stretching. It could be washing your hands with cold water. It could be stepping outside for fresh air. When you catch yourself replaying, do the action immediately. No debate. Let's slow this down with practice. Right now, take a slow breath in, hold, and let it out. As you exhale, imagine closing a tab in your mind. You don't delete it forever. You just close it for now. Notice how your body responds when you give yourself permission to stop thinking about it. One fear that shows up here is, if I stop thinking about it, I'll lose control. But replaying doesn't create control. It creates exhaustion. Control comes from deciding what deserves your attention. When you stop rehearsing, you don't become careless, you become present. There's also a sneaky habit to watch for, checking your phone not to respond, but to soothe anxiety. You tell yourself you're just looking. That keeps the loop alive. When you notice that urge, use the same microscript, this is closed for today. Put the phone down. Let the discomfort rise and fall. Picture this situation. You're at work, trying to focus. You haven't heard back from your ex after holding a boundary. Old you would keep glancing at your phone, half expecting a response. Now you decide to mentally clock out. You put your phone in a drawer or turn it face down. You re-engage with your task. Time passes. You realize you forgot to check for a while. That's not avoidance, that's recovery. Say this sentence with me once, quietly, I don't need to keep this alive in my head. Say it again, slower. Let it land. Another layer of mental attachment is storytelling. You start building narratives about what your ex is thinking or feeling. These stories feel real, but they're guesses. And guesses keep you emotionally invested. When you notice storytelling, bring yourself back to facts. Fact, you set a boundary. Fact, you're allowed to rest. Everything else is noise. This is especially important during quiet moments, commutes, showers, late nights, when the mind looks for something familiar to chew on. If your ex has been a major emotional focus, your mind will default there. That's not failure. It's a habit. Habits change through redirection, not self-criticism. Imagine this moment, because it ties everything together. It's Friday night again. You didn't respond to a message earlier. You feel okay. Then your mind starts replaying what might happen next. Old you would spiral. New you notices the rehearsal and interrupts it. You breathe. You do your chosen physical action. You return to the present. And the night remains calm. This section is about reclaiming your inner space. Silence isn't peace if your mind is still negotiating. Peace begins when you stop keeping the conversation alive internally. When you learn to mentally clock out, emotional distance forms naturally, without force. Hold on to this. In the next part, we're going to bring everything together and talk about how to hold boundaries without hardening your heart, how to stay compassionate without reopening emotional access, especially when you still care deeply. Section 8. The final skill before we put everything under real pressure is learning how to stay compassionate without reopening access. This is where many people slip. They think the only way to protect themselves is to become cold, distant, or hardened. And if this doesn't change, you end up swinging between two extremes: overavailability that hurts you, or emotional shutdown that doesn't feel like who you want to be. Here's the distinction that matters. Compassion is an internal stance. Access is a behavioral choice. You can feel warmth, care, and goodwill towards someone without giving them the same entry points into your time, attention, and emotional processing. A steadier version of you understands that boundaries don't erase compassion, they actually make it sustainable. Why this works is simple. When you confuse compassion with access, you turn kindness into a liability. Every time you feel empathy, you feel obligated to engage. Over time, that trains your nervous system to associate caring with depletion. When you separate the two, something shifts. You're allowed to feel what you feel without acting it out. That separation is what prevents bitterness from building. Here's the internal microscript to use when compassion shows up and tempts you to overstep your boundary: I can care without engaging. Say it once. Let it settle. Let's put this into a very real scenario. Your ex reaches out with something genuinely hard: loss, stress, fear. This isn't manipulation. It's real. Old you would feel compassion and immediately step in. You'd listen, reassure, and maybe stay on the phone longer than you want. You'd tell yourself you're just being human. Now you still feel compassion, but you don't abandon yourself. You respond briefly, kindly, and without opening the door to ongoing emotional support. You might say something supportive, then let the conversation end. And afterward, you don't feel drained. You feel aligned. This works because compassion doesn't require continuity. A moment of kindness doesn't obligate you to remain available indefinitely. Stoic thinkers emphasized goodwill without attachment, wishing others well without tying your peace to their state. In modern terms, this means you can hold care internally while keeping your structure intact. Here's the outward microscript you can use in moments like this: I'm sorry you're dealing with that. I hope you have support. That's it. Notice what's missing. No offer. No follow-up question. No invitation to continue. It's compassionate and complete. Now consider another everyday situation. You're finally starting to feel lighter. Your routines are stabilizing. Then you hear through mutual friends that your ex is struggling. Guilt and compassion surge together. Old you would reach out proactively, reopening contact to check in. New you pauses. You acknowledge the feeling without acting on it. You remind yourself that stepping back doesn't mean wishing harm. It means respecting the boundary you set so both of you can adjust to the new reality. The tiny action here is subtle but important. Today, decide one compassionate behavior you will allow and one you will not. One only. For example, you may allow a brief supportive text, but not phone calls. Or you may allow practical help, but not emotional processing. Write it down. This prevents on-the-spot decisions driven by emotion. Let's slow this down with practice. Take a breath in, hold, and let it out. As you exhale, imagine holding compassion in one hand and your boundary in the other. Notice that you don't have to drop either one. They can coexist. A common fear here is, if I don't show up the way I used to, I'm abandoning them. But abandonment is withdrawal without clarity or care. Boundaries with compassion are neither. You're not disappearing. You're redefining. And redefinition is necessary after any significant relationship ends. Another trap is using compassion as a reason to delay your own healing. You tell yourself, once they're okay, then I'll step back. But there will always be another hard moment. If your healing depends on their emotional state stabilizing first, you give away control of your life. Compassion that costs you your future eventually turns into resentment. Picture this moment. You're in your kitchen, making dinner, feeling calm. Your ex texts something heavy. You feel that familiar pull. Old you would drop everything. New you pauses. You feel compassion. You send one kind sentence. Then you put your phone down and return to your evening. And something important happens. You don't feel like you betrayed yourself. You feel steady. Say this sentence with me once, quietly. Kindness doesn't require self-sacrifice. Say it again, slower. Let your body hear it. There's also compassion toward yourself that often gets overlooked. You may judge yourself for still caring. You may think you should be over it by now. That self-judgment fuels overcompensation, either overengaging or shutting down completely. When you allow yourself to care without acting, you reduce that pressure. You don't have to prove anything. Consider how this changes your identity. You're no longer the person who absorbs emotional weight to keep others comfortable. You're someone who can hold warmth and firmness at the same time. That balance is not weakness. It's emotional maturity. Imagine one last setup before we move on. It's the end of the week. You've practiced clarity, role exit, shorter explanations, delayed responses, guilt tolerance, mental clocking out, and compassionate distance. A message comes in. You feel the old reflex, and then you don't follow it. You choose your response intentionally. The moment passes. And instead of feeling tense or guilty, you feel grounded. This section is about integration. Compassion without access allows you to close emotional loops gently instead of ripping them open or sealing them shut. When you learn this, boundaries stop feeling like rejection and start feeling like care directed in the right direction. Hold on to this balance. In the next part, we're going to step into a full, real-life moment where everything we've talked about gets tested at once: timing, guilt, compassion, mental rehearsal, and you'll see how choosing differently changes the outcome in real time. Section 9. It's Friday night, the kind that feels quietly important. You finished the work week exhausted but lighter than usual. Dinner's done, the kitchen is clean, and you're on the couch with something low-key playing in the background. For the first time in a while, your body feels settled. Not euphoric. Just okay. And then your phone buzzes. It's your ex. The message isn't dramatic. It's not hostile. It's not urgent. It says, "Hey, I've been having a rough night. Thought of you." There it is, that familiar internal jolt. Your chest tightens just enough to get your attention. Your mind starts moving before you tell it to. Old pathways light up automatically. You feel the pull to respond quickly, partly because you care, partly because you don't want to seem cold, and partly because that reflex has lived in you for a long time. For a moment, the old version of you almost takes over. You imagine typing something warm and thoughtful. You imagine a back and forth that lasts the rest of the night. You imagine how it might feel to be close again, even briefly. And you also imagine the aftertaste, the heaviness, the replaying, the sense that you just reopened something you worked hard to contain. You pause. Not dramatically. Just enough to create space. You remember the internal rule you decided on earlier: contact is no longer for emotional processing. You remember that the role you used to play, the late-night emotional support, belongs to a relationship that ended. You remember that immediacy trains attachment, and tonight is not a reply window anyway. Your hand tightens around the phone. You feel the guilt try to sneak in. What if they're really struggling? What kind of person ignores someone who's hurting? The guilt feels convincing for a second. You take one slow breath in. Hold. Let it out. You silently say the line you practiced: "This feeling is about change, not wrongdoing." The guilt doesn't vanish, but it loosens its grip just enough. You don't reply right away. Instead, you put the phone face down on the coffee table. You stand up and stretch, grounding yourself in your body. The room is quiet. You're here. Nothing bad is happening. The urge crests, then begins to fall. A few minutes pass. Now you choose intentionally. You pick up the phone again, not from reflex, but from clarity. You decide that a brief, compassionate response is okay, but not an open door. You type one sentence: "I'm sorry you're having a hard night. I hope you have support." You read it once. You notice the urge to add more, to soften it, to explain, to ask a question that would keep the conversation alive. You don't. You send it. Then you do something that matters just as much as the message itself. You put the phone away. Not nearby. Away. In another room. For a moment, your mind tries to reopen the loop. Did that sound cold? Will they think you don't care? What if they reply again? You catch the rehearsal starting. You use the other line you practiced: "This conversation is closed for today." You breathe. You redirect. You sit back down. You let yourself actually be in your evening. 10 minutes pass. Then 20. You realize something subtle but important. Your body hasn't gone into that familiar alert state. You're not waiting for the next buzz. You're not scanning. The calm you had before the message is still here. It wobbled, but it didn't disappear. Later that night, just before bed, you check your phone once. There's no new message. And even if there were, you know what you'd do. Not because you're rigid, but because you've practiced. As you get into bed, another wave of emotion passes through. Not anxiety this time. Sadness. A quiet acknowledgement that something really is over. You let that feeling be there. You don't numb it by reopening contact. You don't run from it by distracting yourself. You just let it exist. You take a slow breath in. Hold. Out. This is what responding instead of reacting looks like in real life. Not perfect. Not emotionless. Just intentional. You didn't harden your heart. You didn't disappear. You didn't betray your values. You stayed compassionate without sacrificing your stability. You respected the boundary you set, not just in what you said, but in timing, attention, and follow-through. When you turn the light off, your mind doesn't replay the conversation on a loop. There's nothing to rehearse. You did what you decided you would do. And that alignment creates something rare and valuable. You sleep. Not because everything is resolved, but because, for tonight, you chose yourself calmly. And that choice didn't require drama, explanation, or force. Just presence. This is the payoff. Not control over another person. Control over your response. And once you experience this even once, your nervous system starts to trust you again. Section 10. What this entire episode has really been about is the difference between being emotionally pulled and being emotionally grounded. When you're still in contact with an ex you care about, the danger isn't the feeling itself. It's losing agency. Reacting keeps you orbiting the past. Responding puts you back in control of how much access your life allows. We began by naming the quiet trap most people never confront. Staying reachable without clarity keeps your nervous system stuck in almost. You're not together, but you're not free either. Then we slowed things down and defined what contact is actually for, because ambiguity keeps your mind alert and unsettled. After that, you stepped out of the emotional role you used to play, understanding that roles don't end when relationships do, they end when behavior changes. Next, you learned why over-explaining boundaries invites negotiation and drains you, and how saying less creates more stability. Then we shifted from words to timing, seeing how immediate responses keep emotional attachment alive even when the message itself is neutral. After that, we faced guilt directly, recognizing it not as proof of wrongdoing, but as a natural signal that a role is dissolving. Then you practiced mentally clocking out, so silence didn't turn into endless rehearsal and imaginary conversations. After that, you learned how to stay compassionate without reopening access, separating care from availability so kindness didn't require self-sacrifice. Finally, we walked through that Friday night moment where everything was tested at once: timing, guilt, compassion, restraint, and you saw how one intentional response protected your peace without hardening your heart. The deeper lesson underneath all of this is simple but demanding. Healing doesn't come from cutting people off dramatically, and it doesn't come from staying endlessly accessible either. It comes from alignment. When your behavior matches what your nervous system actually needs, things settle. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop replaying conversations. You stop waiting for the next message to decide how your evening will go. That's not indifference. That's self-trust. Now let's anchor this with 3 actions you can take today. First, write one clear sentence that defines what contact with your ex is for right now, and read it before responding to any message so you're acting from intention instead of impulse. Second, choose one reply window and commit to it for the next week, letting timing do the work of reducing emotional charge without confrontation. Third, practice using one short, compassionate boundary sentence without adding explanations, even when guilt shows up, so clarity becomes a habit instead of a performance. As you do this, expect some discomfort. That doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're no longer defaulting to old patterns. Emotional freedom often feels strange at first because your system has been used to being pulled. With repetition, that strangeness becomes calm. If this episode landed for you, the next lesson you'll want to watch is about letting go of hope without becoming bitter, how expectations quietly keep emotional ties alive even when relationships are over, and how releasing them creates space for something new. If you want a whole library of Stoic Focus lessons on emotional control, boundaries, and relationships, this is what we do here every week. If you feel messages like this need to reach more people, hit like, tap subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.